Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omoyemi Akerele. I'm the founder and executive director of Stylehouse Files Lagos Fashion Week. I want to start by saying a big thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here today. We've all had an incredibly long year, and I almost didn't make it because it's been quite an interesting year. So I want to say thank you for the invitation. Thank you in particular to Imre and Esther for their patience and support throughout the process. Today, I'll be talking about ethical supply chain inclusivity. Ethical supply chain, inclusivity, diversity, and the question of representation. I look forward to this conversation because it's something that's really particularly dear to my heart. I'm going to start by talking about clicker. Sorry, bear with me. Thanks. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about who we are and where we've come from. Fashion within African communities and other, communities with similar culture have been deeply rooted in the practice of sustainability, ethical fashion, and slow fashion since inception. For us, creativity has always been a community act. Take a look at Laduma, whose work is largely inspired by his tribe, the Tosa tribe, and the fact that he works with knitwear, the community is involved in the process, he celebrates them every chance he gets, every step of the way. That shows. One second, tells you a little bit about who we are. African fashion culture is rooted in practice of sustainability, ethical fashion, slow fashion. Designers have always had respect for the communities they source from, their workers and the environment. This community approach to creation shows a bit of respect for both natural resources and human resources, and it's the foundation of our creative process. I gave a keynote address recently at the Future of Fashion conference in South Africa. Virtually, of course. They premiered, it was called Future of Fashion by Rewoven, and they premiered a short film titled Our Way of Being. And it spoke to the idea that often when we think of eco-sustainable living or ethical supply chain, what comes to mind is some sort of Eurocentric or American representation of what that is or what that could possibly mean. But reality is, and it sort of gives off the impression that either Africans cannot afford it, but over time, it's something that has been a part of us. Africans have lived in harmony with nature for such a long time, and indigenous communities similar to ours all over the world. And for communities like this, sustainable living has always been our way of being. In this community, the belief is everyone and everything matters. Sorry, I'm just trying to get a hang of using the clicker and doing this at the same time. So in this community, the belief is everyone and everything matters. When you bring this back home a bit, and think about our industry and the fact that it's fundamentally extractive of both natural resources and human resources across our value chain, across our value cycles, concepts of recycling, repurpose, and reuse are not alien to our people, though, because the very notion of waste goes against the foundation of our way of being. Therefore, whether we want to be subconscious about it or we want to be deliberate, indigenous communities across Africa have always had a strong focus on environmental impact, which is inextricably linked to human impact. We fall short of it. I'm not saying that, it's the perfect state, or anything like that. It's something that we're also still quite conscious about and working towards to create that state of utopia. Um, Looking at a designer like Emi Kasbid, for example, who's decided to go back to Akwete in southeastern Nigeria to work with community of weavers who are all women. In this tribe, only women are weavers. They do. It's not even considered a man's task. He decided to, empower the communities, through giving them more work, education, cross pollination of ideas, if possible, just to create that sort of linkage between his a rural urban migration, you know, ensure that they're constantly a part of his story and constantly a part of his narrative. Um, so which brings us to looking at the ethical supply chain itself. Ethical supply chains have harped over and over on the importance of ensuring that the people, profits, and environment are protected at fashion's value cycle. A truly ethical company strives to make sure that its supply chain empowers workers, pays them a living wage, and at the same time, understands their impact on the environment, manages their carbon footprint, reduces gas house emissions, and conservation of diversity. That would be like the ideal scenario, right? But if we take a closer look at it, it seems there's little or no progress when it comes to protecting people within our ethical supply chains. While a lot of investment, technology, and innovation seems to have gone into protecting the environment, into talking about climate change, and rightfully so, because this is the only planet we have, rightfully so, because, protection of the environment is the protection of its people. However, one might begin to wonder that human impact itself is still lagging behind considerably. A lot of brands seem to fall short of achieving this social justice that we clamor to have through their inherent lack of diversity, through their inherent lack of inclusivity and representation where it matters most. The ethical supply chain the ethical supply chain consistently projects a facade of equality, but this is far from the case, and we all know it. The human impact we seek to protect should not only be limited to the people at the top of this pyramid. It shouldn't be, we should be especially mindful of the human impact on people who are also at the bottom of the pyramid. And if we take a closer look, these are the people who have been marginalized. They're usually the voiceless. They're usually people who've been exploited. Our ethical supply chains must strive to enable, must strive to reactivate, must strive to open up resources and opportunities to everybody, irrespective of where they're from, irrespective of their jobs, irrespective of what they do. So, which brings us to looking at what exactly is the foundation of the ethical supply chain. We all know that equality is the foundation of an ethical supply chain. It is fundamentally the most basic ethical practice of all, and it has to be fully explored in terms of whether we're looking at it from how people are paid or compensated for the work they do. Either if we're looking at it in terms of education, either we're looking at it in terms of disability, anti-oppressive practice. These are areas, these are things that we need to be consciously mindful of as we explore what the foundation is and what we're hoping or what we seek to achieve. We have to explore the principles of equality, and equal access is important, equal opportunities, equal representation. But the reality is, the ethical supply chain does not currently operate within these guiding principles of equality across the entire value cycle, from sourcing right down to end use. What we find, that's prevalent is inequality affects the most vulnerable in our society. People all over the world work in disadvantageous conditions that's been created by other humans across our ethical supply chains. Which brings us to, something that's really very important. Who are the humans of ethical supply chains? Considering that it falls short when it comes to considering ethical supply chains falls short with human impact and human representation. These are people that increasingly are not as visible as we want them to be. They're not as celebrated as we want them to be. They're not as mentioned as we want them to be. And that's why we must applaud the efforts of visionaries like the Fashion Revolution team, who have consistently ensured that the subject of exploitation of people remains at the forefront. But we need more platforms like this. We need more people. We need everyday people like you and I at the forefront of ensuring that, all of this is done. We might, we ask ourselves, is there any progress has any progress been made? But we know, as a matter of fact, that the global apparel and textile ecosystem, we have a long way to achieve, a long way to go before we can achieve this equilibrium, before we can achieve this equilibrium that's needed to create a balance. There's got to be a balance within the foundation of our ethical supply chain. Discriminatory practice of the industry needs to be adequately addressed and solved if fashion wants to make true progress with its environmental and sustainability goals. Inclusivity, diversity, and the question of representation. We've established, in conversation that there is a struggle with balance across the ethical supply chain, across the notion of people, process, and environment. This relative lack of inclusivity, diversity, and representation it shouldn't be a shock. Let's face it, lack of inclusion, lack of diversity and representation, it's not new. It's been with us for a while. All of these things are not things, they didn't just start happening today. They've been a part of us. I guess it's more obvious now that, when we realize that the people who are at the forefront of talking about ethical supply chains or the need to have ethical supply chains are themselves guilty, I guess, of perpetrating acts of inequality as well by not encouraging inclusivity, diversity, and representation. But this should be more than a conversation. How do we move this from a conversation to, reinforcing that people matter, to reinforcing that representation matters, to enforcing that, it's not just about race. It should be beyond that. It's not just about a marketing campaign. It should be beyond that. There's a huge gap between what a lot of companies communicate and what happens in reality. For example, this year with the race pandemic as well, a lot of people have seen the need to rise up to have more conversations around this. Or James launched the 15% pledge. There's Black Power Pan Friday, and we at Lagos Fashion Week are constantly striving to try to get our designers represented in stores globally, not just within our country, which we do on a regular, but beyond that, how do we get representation from them in that way, considering the role their work plays in amplifying the voices of creatives in the environment. So the clamor for an urgent migration to ethical supply chains cannot be successful without an acknowledgement of the elephant in the room: diversity, inclusivity, representation. There's a deep connection between climate change and equality. The system of oppression that have led to the marginalization of people is also the same system that encourages environmental violations to thrive. That's what people say. It's been said. It's been a subject of many discourse and many opinions. We must adopt a more mindful approach, a more mindful strategy to ensure we strive for balance in this approach to equality within our supply chains. We have to address questions of representation, questions of diversity with the same intensity that we address the environment and processes relating to it. Fashion as a whole, talking about inclusion, fashion as a whole it hasn't been known for being diverse or inclusive. Its very foundation is steeped in elitism. But how can clothing, that's the question you ask. Clothing is a basic human need. How can it seek to constantly promote inequality? Fashion's obsession with particular demographic, particular image, size, marginalization of minorities has been ongoing for years to the exclusion of others. So talking to one, last week we had a conversation at Lagos Fashion Week, and the CEO of Red Carpet Green Dress, Samantha, when I asked this question about inclusivity, he said something very profound. Here's the thing about inclusion. The word inclusion does not mean we're looking to be included in your conversation. We're rather saying you're missing out and need to be a part of conversations in spaces you don't recognize. And take a look at it. The plus size industry, look at the value of the industry. It's blossoming, it's huge, it's growing in terms of numbers. So how long are we going to think that by excluding people from conversations means that, they're no longer empowered to do what they do? Diversifying our ethical supply chain should be a quick win. It should be a good way to represent the communities we serve. When we talk about diversity, the focus should be on how are we going to gradually redistribute resources, access, and power? How do we create a level playing field? How do we ensure equal access? How do we ensure equal opportunities for resources? The fashion industries, yes, we know we're behind, but how do we put people and planet consistently at the same time, at the same level, not one at the expense of the other, for the purpose merely for the purpose of marketing. We need to start looking at the value cycle in its entirety and not just focus on one area and what how we can do representation. The world has become one global community, and we need to represent this community we serve. The right mix of perspectives and opinions are needed in order for every one of us to win in today's world. A failure of representation is glaring. It's glaring across marketing strategies, advertising, consumption within the ethical supply chain today. Oftentimes, we ask ourselves, what do companies, what do they really think? As someone who's a person of color and interaction with other brown people in brown communities and biracial people, you can't help but ask yourself that there's and have these conversations around the failure of representation. But we're no longer asking to be noticed. We just want to ensure that we're part of a system that drive people towards the benefits of telling our stories, so that we can strengthen our communities. But how do we gradually start to think and ask ourselves about the need to drive people towards the benefits of ethical supply chains if there's no change internally. How far the industry has come is illustrated by the recent failure of high street brands to pay for their cancelled orders once the coronavirus pandemic was over. That was so interesting to see. I really genuinely thought that we'd done quite a bit of work with this. And then the pandemic hits, and then we realized that there's some companies who've been profiting off the back of workers for decades, turned their backs when the workers needed them most, leaving millions of people economically stranded. It shows you how much work is done. People of color are left behind, marginalized people are left behind, exploited people are left behind, and that's the backdrop on which this ethical supply chain, where it seems people are building. That's the backdrop that that people are using to build companies and have these conversations. As long as it's out there in their marketing strategy, there's a perception that the entire ethical supply chain is equal. But we need to lift the veil. The time has come for us to lift the veil. And in lifting the veil, we have to ensure there's change within the sector. We have to ensure that this change can be reinforced significantly at management level, because that's where decision-making power is mostly constituted. And in doing that, you need to ask yourself, how diverse is the decision-making body of all these organizations? Beyond the boardroom, we have to start asking ourselves the question, who are the influencers? Who are the voices of change? Who are the models? Who are the creative talents? The ethical supply chain, our ethical supply chains must be as mindful of the people as it's mindful of the environment. I can't emphasize this enough, over and over again. It seems like people think that we always want to make it seem like it's about people of color, but why shouldn't we lead with identity? Why shouldn't we lead with race? Why do people want to talk about diversity without representation? Why do you want to adopt our human resources, our natural resources as well, without a care for human impact? Why do you want to feed off our culture, but you don't want people to benefit from it? Lisa Folawiyo's collection was not just a collection, the print was used by New York and Co., and they were profiting off it. Laduma as well, by Zara, And the conversations are really interesting because these companies constantly tell us how they're improving on their, carbon footprint and all of that, but there has to be a new sense of awareness. We have to go back as far as hiring, examining hiring processes. I find myself, I also have to check myself, because constantly I find myself as either one of two or one of three or one of six Black people in a place. I have to tell myself that I need to be careful so I don't end up being the token representation for my community. So yes, to a new sense of awareness. Yes, to ensure that the systems that exist, we have to check how people are committed to career development, community engagement beyond their press releases. It has to be well thought out. It has to be meaningful. So which brings me to, closing. People have talked about intersectional environmentalism. It's such a mouthful about it being the solution. And it just speaks, it's a new wave, right, that speaks the necessity of addressing inclusivity and diversity alongside environmental protection efforts. But do we really need another movement to motivate us to do what is right? Why can't there be a deliberate mindfulness on your part, on my part, on everyone's part to strive for that balance? Why can't we bridge our gap, the gap that exists, the wide gap that exists between our intentions and actions? Let's stop talking, and it's time to take action with simple things. Diversify your leadership and management structures, diversify representation, diversify recruitment process, diversify your feed, diversify your audience. It starts with you and I. Thank you very much. Can I keep going? It looks like I have, my time's run out. So which brings me to conclude that, we all need to adopt an attitude of consciousness around this conversation until it collectively becomes our way of being, as said by the people of future of fashion, by the Rewoven guys, Esefu and her team, our way of being. It is the future we all want to see. Let us work together to try and achieve this. But we have to be mindful of the people, creating equality, creating equal structures, equality in pay, equality of representation, equality of access as well. It's the only way out. Thank you very much.